you tell for our viewers just a bit more about your book, because the title of your book is really interesting, and it says Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution. Why is there a need for a sexual revolution in the Middle East, and what's the main problem between, you always say there is a big problem with misogyny in the Middle East, but is it only Middle East?
No, you know, I make it very clear in the introduction to my book that misogyny is universal, that it exists on a spectrum across the world, and that every country has a place on that spectrum. So here in Bosnia, in Turkey, in Egypt, in Zimbabwe, in the United States, the entire world has not managed to rid itself of misogyny. But what I'm doing with my book is I'm writing this book as an Egyptian feminist who is also a Muslim, who has been shaped by this part of the world, because I was born in Egypt and I spent my teenage years in Saudi Arabia. I reported from Jerusalem and from Libya, and so I know this part of the world very well. So I wanted to write this book as that woman, but also as someone who, these revolutions that happened in the Middle East and North Africa had long been a dream of mine and a dream of many people in the region, to rid ourselves of dictatorship and to rid ourselves of military regimes. So what I say in my book is, we began a political revolution because the regimes in that part of the world oppress everybody, men and women. And you saw when the coverage of the revolutions, men and women were together in Tahrir Square, in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, in Bahrain, men and women together against the regime. But then when the women went home, when they looked around at the men that they went to the streets with, we began to realize that these men were not on our side necessarily. That just because a man is a revolutionary does not mean he's not a misogynist. So what the point I make in my book is that the Mubarak in the presidential palace oppresses everybody. But there's a Mubarak on the street corner and there's a Mubarak in the home. And those three Mubaraks, and I call them the trifecta of misogyny, the state, the street, and the home, together oppress women. And so it's my contention in the book that unless we have a social and a sexual revolution, our political revolution will fail. So when you look at my country of birth, Egypt, for example, we're constantly stuck between military regime and Muslim Brotherhood. And neither of these is good for women, and neither of these is good for freedom or liberation. So the sexual revolution is one of those two double revolutions, social and sexual, that we need so that we can overthrow all of these three Mubaraks or all of these three dictatorships.
Did we saw that social revolution after Arab Spring in all these countries affected by Arab Spring in the area?
We begin to see various manifestations of it. For example, in Tunisia, recently an LGBTQ organization, non-governmental organization, got a license. So you're seeing that, you know, even in countries where you didn't hear about gay and lesbian rights or queer existence, that people are speaking up. You're seeing in Egypt, for example, many groups that came up after the revolution began that would go onto the street and defend women against sexual violence. You're seeing in a country like Morocco and in Jordan, where there hasn't even been, you know, a so-called revolution, that feminist groups there are fighting against incredibly unjust legislation that allows a rapist to escape conviction if he agrees to marry his victim. So you're seeing in Saudi Arabia, which is probably one of the most conservative countries in the region, that women there, inspired by the revolution, began to start driving more publicly, began to call for legislation to protect women against domestic violence, all of this. So I firmly believe, because I'm a tenacious optimist, that in all of these countries you're seeing the social and the sexual revolution begin. And it's very important because we need a revolution from the ground up. We can't have a revolution from the top bottom, because that will be a false revolution.
You also wrote a very, very interesting article named "Why Do They Hate Us?" And in 2012 they break many borders and opened a lot of discussions around the world. Yes. Do you see any change since 2012 in respect of women and rights and everything, and how the rest of the world is basically seeing today rights of a female, not only in the Middle East but across the world?
Yes, I definitely see a difference. I mean, as you will remember, when I wrote that essay, I was attacked, you know, from many different people, and I think the reason that people were so upset is that they think that when you write about misogyny, or when I write about misogyny in the Middle East and North Africa, I'm saying that only in this part of the world are women treated like this, and obviously that's not what I'm saying. And so I think that for a very long time we were too defensive about what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa. You know, when it comes to women's rights, people believe falsely that it belongs in the private sphere. You know, don't talk about this in English. Don't talk about this loudly. Don't talk about this in front of foreigners, you know? And so I believe that just as we talk about human rights violations in the Middle East and North Africa, just as we talk about economic corruption openly, we should talk about the violation of women's rights openly. Nobody tells you, if you write an essay in foreign policy about torture and human rights violations, you can't say this in English, you must only speak about this in whispers in Arabic. So it's very important for me to break that silence. And I think that, you know, after that initial shock when a lot of people were upset with me, I firmly believe that many people across the region are speaking loudly now about these conversations. And I think that thanks to social media, we are able now as feminist activists around the world to connect our issues. So for example, I am in touch with feminists in India, I'm in touch with feminists in Pakistan, South Africa, the United States, various parts of Latin America, all over the world. And so now when I travel for my book, for example, I was in Lahore in Pakistan in February. I went to speak at the Lahore Literary Festival, just like I'm here for the book stand Sarajevo Lit Fest. And I reached out to a group of young feminists there, and they have an organization called Girls at Dubbers. And what they do is they go to coffee shops and restaurants that in Pakistani culture are just for men. And as a part of breaking that public space, and they assert their right as women to be in public space. So they go there and they demand to be served in these coffee shops and restaurants that used to be just for men. So I wrote to them because a feminist group in India that does something similar in India connected me with them. And so I went to Lahore and said, I would like to meet you. And they took me to one of these restaurants that are usually just for men. And I sat and I listened, you know, because it's very important for me. I identify as a global feminist, not just as an Egyptian or Middle East feminist. And I did the same when I went to Johannesburg in May. After I gave my talks in Johannesburg, I contacted one of the young feminist activists there, and she goes to university in Johannesburg, and she's part of a movement called Fees Must Fall. And they have been fighting for a year now to reduce university fees. And the feminists among this movement have been staging protests at the university campuses against sexual violence. And some of those protests were so large that the university, I think it's called Wits University, shut down classes. So this idea that feminist activists in South Africa, that has some of the highest rates in the world of rape and sexual violence, were able to shut down university so that they could make the university take seriously sexual violence, it excites me and gives me hope. So I think because, thanks to social media, you're hearing now voices of people you never used to hear before, who had no access to what we call mainstream media, who are now creating a presence for ourselves and connecting each other on social media through Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, Facebook, Snapchat, all of this. And I think that is going to help us create this global feminist revolution that I fully believe is the best hope for our world, especially in today with fascism, you know, across the world on the rise.
You have opened that discussion on social media in 2011, and I really remember that when you released those pictures when police in Egypt broke both of your arms and when you were sexually assaulted. What was that experience for you, and how important was that channel of communication which you had on social media to open discussion and show the world what's really happening there at the moments when revolution was going on against Mubarak regime?
Yes. Well, you know, for me personally, you know, I'm a writer, and I used to be a journalist. I don't identify as a journalist anymore. I identify as a writer. But it was to be assaulted in the way that I was assaulted, with breaking my arms and sexually assaulting me and then detaining me, the police and then the military, for me really helped me understand consequence. In that I think that especially for a lot of writers, our words are in one sphere and our action is in another sphere. And I think at that moment when I was assaulted and detained, those two spheres became one. So I understood the price that you can pay to be a writer and an activist at the same time. But also at the same time, I considered myself very lucky, because I have a profile, because people know who I am, and because people listen to me on social media, and you know, I'm quote unquote famous. And I honestly believe that Twitter saved my life. And I say this because after I was detained, I lost my phone. When police were assaulting me, I lost my phone. So for about 3 hours, I disappeared. And nobody knew where I was. My family didn't know. They thought I was dead. And then in the Interior Ministry, while I was being held, an activist came to talk to the police about something else. They didn't know who I was. And I asked to use their smartphone so I could write on Twitter that I had been detained. So I got onto this activist smartphone and I tweeted, beaten, arrested, Interior Ministry. And I sent out the tweet. And, you know, 10 seconds later, his phone died because his battery was very low. So I don't know what would have happened if I did not have access to his smartphone. That tweet alone, because I had a large following on Twitter, The Guardian and Al Jazeera reported on what happened to me. And the State Department, because I'm also a US citizen, I'm a dual citizen, Egyptian American, the State Department wrote back to me and said, we're following up on this. So I considered myself very lucky. Even though, you know, the police could have killed me, even though I was threatened with gang rape, people could hear me. Many other activists who are abused in this way in Egypt are anonymous, and we have no idea who they are, and they suffer silently. And I discovered later, after I was released, that 12 other Egyptian women were beaten and assaulted, sexually assaulted in exactly the same way that I was, but they have not been able to speak, either because their family silenced them or they're too ashamed. And then you remember the iconic image of the woman in Tahrir Square who was stripped down to her blue bra and the soldiers were stomping on her. This woman I consider a hero of our revolution. But to this day, we don't know her name because her family has silenced her. Because her family, instead of being proud of her courage and of how what happened to her exposed the brutality of our military regime, her family are ashamed. Now, until the day when we begin to acknowledge this woman as a hero, until the day that we build a statue for her as one of our revolutionary heroes. You know, we have a statue for the unknown soldier. We need a statue for the unknown woman revolutionary. Because until that day comes, and that is the day of the social and the sexual revolution, our voices will remain silent. So for me, using Twitter to tell the world what happened, taking pictures of the bruises of my arms, taking pictures of my arms in a cast, that for me helped to break the silence. But again, it's because I'm lucky and because I have the privilege of a platform. And I'm hoping that when I use this privilege of a platform, and when I provoke, you know, because one of my tools is provocation. And I want to punch you in the place where it hurts. To say, look, they sexually assaulted me, and I explain in detail that I was taking hands out of my trousers, that their hands were on my breasts in front of their officer, the supervising officer. Very few people talk about this in Egypt because of the taboo. But now you hear more and more women explain exactly how they were sexually assaulted. And it is only through this provocation that we can break this silence of taboo and shame. And so because I have this platform, I'm lucky enough that and because I'm older as well, you know, I will be 49 next week. So this idea of shame and taboo and virginity and all of this doesn't apply to me. So what I'm trying to do is this platform that I have, I want it to be much bigger so that other women can stand alongside me on this platform.
The other two very important issues for you, and I know that you're speaking of them a lot of times. One is genital mutilation, and the other one is your own choice to being covered in the past and then take your cover off and pursue different career and a different way of life. How those two elements are important for females in the Middle East, but also in the world, to understand that the choice is really in your hands, that you're choosing your own life.
I think the best way to answer this is to explain why I chose the title Headscarves and Hymens for my book. Because as a Muslim woman and as a feminist, I believe that Muslim women are stuck between what's on our head and what's in between our legs. And that's how we're constantly, this paradigm, we're constantly identified and put into these two boxes. So I explain how I chose at the age of 16 to wear hijab, and then I chose, and again I use these inverted commas, at the age of 25 to take off my hijab. And I devote an entire chapter in my book to the issue of veiling. And I explain, you know, in great detail how difficult it was for me to take off my hijab. And I say, you know, at the end, it took me 8 years to take off my hijab. So I wore it for 9 years, but it took me 8 years to take it off, because very soon after I began to wear my hijab, I realized I did not like it. It did not, I couldn't feel comfortable in it. I looked in the mirror, it didn't look like me, and I felt the external and the internal me were moving further and further away. But it was very difficult. to take off my hijab because of my family's protests, because of society, because of religion, because of the socialization, you know, and the way we put women in hijab on a pedestal, you know, as the best pure woman. So I talk about that, and I talk about how long it took for me to fight against my hijab. And to connect with FGM now, I am not cut. And I am the first generation in my family that is not cut. So again, I'm very lucky. But I talk in my book as well, because I devote a whole chapter to sex. And this was the most difficult chapter to write. I talk about how long it took me to fight my hymen. So I fought my hijab and I fought my hymen. And it was very difficult for me to write about this, but I made myself write about how I waited until I was 29 to have sex. Because I was raised with the idea that you must wait to be married to have sex. But then, you know, I became a journalist and I became very busy in my life, and I didn't meet anyone that I wanted to marry. And I say in my book openly, I got fed up of waiting, so I decided to have sex. But it makes me very sad that I waited this long to begin to enjoy something that is very pleasurable, that is very beautiful. And so I talk openly about this because I think that we do a great injustice to our young women, especially when we impose this this oppression of virginity on them. Because, you know, some people will say to you, oh, you know, modesty and virginity are for Muslim men and women. And this is false. This is pure and utter hypocrisy, because Muslim men are not put into this box of modesty and virginity in the same way that Muslim women are. So part of what I do to encourage my own social and sexual revolution is that just as to rise up against the regime, we had to break the barrier of fear. To rise up against the Mubarak on the street corner and the Mubarak in the bedroom, we must break the barrier of taboo and shame. So my way of breaking the barrier of taboo and shame is to talk about how long it took me to fight my hijab and how even longer it took me to fight against my hymen. And when it comes to female genital mutilation, especially in my country of birth, Egypt, where the rates for women between the age of 15 to 49 are 91%. Can you imagine? That is the majority of our women. And what we call progress is that for girls between the age of 15 to 17, it's now 69%. That is still 2/3 of our girls are subjected to sexual cruelty and torture, all in the name of controlling their sexuality. So part of the provocation that is my social and sexual revolution is I now talk as that woman who waited until she was 29 to have sex. And now I say, my sexual revolution has been to go from that 29-year-old virgin to now the 49-year-old woman who claims openly and proudly that it is my right to have sex with whomever, whenever, a woman or a man, whenever I choose, obviously with their consent, because that is my sexual revolution. So when I talk about that openly, as that Muslim woman and as that feminist, I'm hoping that it helps other Muslim women to break their own barrier of taboo and shame.
Last year we had a situation where when Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau introduced a 50-50 government with 50% of females and 50% males, we had a situation that everybody had asked him about that, and he says, why are you asking me? It's a 21st century. Now we have a female prime minister in Great Britain, and Theresa May have said, listen, I'm going to put more and more females at the top government positions. Would those two stories have any impact on the world stage when it comes to the rights of females, not only in the Middle East, but across the world? Can they influence making decisions when it comes to females in the government and in general life? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, you know, again, misogyny and discrimination against women is global. It doesn't exist it's not owned by just one part of the world. So, and that's why people were so surprised that Justin Trudeau had a cabinet that was 50-50. And I think, you know, to answer this question, I think it's very important, first of all, to talk about Theresa May and her politics. Because I'm a feminist, but I also recognize that feminism and the rights of women is more than just having a woman in a position of power. It's very important visually to see a woman in a position of power. But when I look at a woman like Theresa May, whose politics I consider to be very conservative and whose politics are very, you know, dissimilar to mine. I do not support Theresa May's politics in the same way that I didn't support her predecessor in the Conservative Party as a woman, Margaret Thatcher's politics. But I think visually it's very important to have a woman in a position of power. But it's even more important to have a woman in a position of power whose politics are feminist, whose politics are against militarism, whose politics are against overgrown capitalism, and whose politics are about equality and liberation for women around the world, which I do not believe are the politics of Theresa May. I would point to Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland as a much better example of a woman whose politics I agree with. But at the end of the day, it is very important that we begin to make normal this idea that a woman can be in a position of power. Because, you know, when we look at women around the world now, we have Angela Merkel, we have Christine Lagarde, we have Theresa May, we have Nicola Sturgeon. We have women in these positions of power. But I think to fully make feminism a reality across the world, I would much rather these women promote feminist politics rather than just be, you know, token women in positions of power that at the end of the day, I believe, prop up a form of patriarchy that is not useful for women. So, and in the opposite way, Justin Trudeau is a man who I believe is promoting a feminism that is much more powerful than Theresa May's. Now, I'm a fan of quotas. So there are some feminists who are not fans of quotas. I believe that there are some parts of the world, including mine, for example, where women absolutely need quotas so that we begin to normalize what is the abnormal. And there was a beautiful moment for me as an Egyptian feminist in 2014 during the World Cup final. Do you remember the World Cup was in Brazil? And for the final ceremony to give out the medals after Germany won, Angela Merkel was there, Dilma Rousseff was still the president of Brazil, and there was also the woman who was president of Argentina. I forget her name, but the president of Argentina. Cristina Kirchner, exactly. All those three women were there, and no, I think maybe it was just Rousseff and Merkel. And my father and I were watching the World Cup final in a Cairo cafe that was mixed. So it was men and women, girls and boys. And there was a family sitting next to us where they had their sons and daughters with them. And one of the boys asked his father, you know, Baba, who are these women? So his father said to him, oh, they're the leaders of Brazil and Germany. And the little boy was astonished. And he turned to his father and he said, can a woman be a leader of a country? And I thought, you know what, this is a great moment. So I turned to this little boy and I said to him, you know what? Who was playing in the final? And he said Brazil and Argentina. I said to him, well, you know, the leaders of Brazil and, Germany and Argentina. I said to him, the leaders of Germany and Argentina are women, and the World Cup is in Brazil, and the leader of Brazil is a woman. All of those three countries have women leaders. So yes, women can be leaders. He was astonished. So it was a great moment to show these children that even though in Egypt we have not had this, to see these three women on television around the world as three women leaders was very, very helpful.
We are now in a situation that we have a potential to have a female leader in your other country, in your second home, in the United States. There is a Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. Is there a real chance that Hillary Clinton will win these elections in November and become first female president of the United States?
Well, I mean, when it comes to the elections this November in the United States, my biggest goal and my biggest hope is that we defeat Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is a fascist and a racist, a misogynist and a bigot. He represents for me the worst of politics around the world right now, because we see Boris Johnson as the Foreign Secretary of the UK, we see Marine Le Pen becoming more and more powerful in France, and now Donald Trump and what he represents in the United States. So I'm extremely worried as an American citizen, as a feminist, and as someone who considers herself, again, this global feminist because of what Donald Trump represents, and also his vice presidential nominee, Pence, because his policies in his home state, Indiana, have been very anti-women and very anti-LGBTQ. So I'm incredibly worried about what's going to happen in the United States. And I say this as someone who's not a big fan of the Clintons, neither Bill nor Hillary, because again, I think that Hillary's voting record in the past, whether it comes to militarism or banks or any of that, is not something that personally is close to my politics. But again, anybody but Donald Trump, because I think it's incredibly dangerous. The United States is at this moment where I think white Americans realize that they are losing their majority status, because within the next 10 to 20 years, white Americans will become one of many minority groups. So we're seeing all of this panic, especially among white men in the United States, that they're losing their power. And Donald Trump represents for them this hold on power that they don't want to let go. So I hope that Hillary Clinton wins, even though I'm not a personal fan of her politics, because I believe that we must defeat Donald Trump at any cost. Now, once, I hope, a woman becomes president of the United States, I will say it's about time, because it's a shame that the United States would wait this long to have a woman president. So meet me on November the 5th, and then hopefully I will celebrate with you.
Let's move just a bit more to world of politics, and we have several important issues which are dealt in all parts of the world, especially in part of the Middle East, because on one side we have Turkey, on the other side we have Syria, we have Iraq, we have Egypt. Especially three elements are important. One is terrorism, one is attempted coup in Turkey, and the third one is a war in Syria and this migrant crisis. How those events will play on the global scene, and what their impact will be on a global scene when we are looking at the moment? Yes,
well, I think, you know, what is happening in all of those countries, especially in Syria. I mean, the Syrian scenario right now is incredibly tragic because half the Syrian population has been displaced. Millions of Syrians have had to flee because of the violence. And this is at a time where the global community has been incredibly uncompassionate to the plight of refugees. I think this is the biggest refugee crisis or humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. And unfortunately, it's coinciding with the rise of right-wing fascist politics in European countries that should be the first to welcome these refugees, because those European countries have their own history with humanitarian crisis and they should understand. So it's a very worrying moment that this is happening. And for me as a feminist, the way that I connect all of these issues, whether it's ISIS in Iraq and Syria, or what's happening in Turkey, or what's happening in Egypt or Syria, is that whenever you have times of turbulence, whether it's wars or violent militant attacks, or a military dictatorship as we have in Egypt, or military fascism as we have in Egypt, because Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is our fascist dictator, and we're seeing Erdogan now in Turkey with his own form of fascism. I believe that women and girls are the biggest victims, and the biggest, that kind of violence and that kind of mindset has the worst impact on girls and women. When you look at any wars around the world, those who are affected the most are girls and women. When you look at the refugee crisis, those affected the most are girls and women. But we very rarely talk about the refugee crisis as a feminist crisis. We very rarely talk about war as a feminist issue. And I believe that unless we do, that the girls and women who suffer on multiple levels in these countries will continue to suffer even worse, whether it's because of sexual enslavement by ISIS, or because of what's happening in Turkey now is many feminist groups have been speaking out about how all of the political parties in Turkey are subjugating women. All of them are using the body of women to enact revenge. So you now hear people saying, I will rape your wife in revenge for attempting the coup. You hear about sexual violence being perpetrated against women on the streets when they protest against the coup. And we saw this scenario in Egypt. And I would like to connect this idea of the need to talk about wars as a feminist issue with what happened here in Bosnia during the war. Because, you know, one of the things I would like to do personally and politically for me, it's important to go to Srebrenica, but it's also important for me to meet with women who survived the rape and sexual violence of the war. And it's important for me because, you know, I believe, like many parts of the world, women here have been silenced from talking about what happened to them. And I think that this idea of who is a worthy victim and whose struggle and survival is worth remembering. And I think, again, because of these barriers of taboo and shame, many women who survived the awful sexual violence and the sexual enslavement and the rape camps have been silenced because of this societal shame and because of their own trouble being heard and accepted and respected by their communities. So I think when we connect all of these war zones and all of these humanitarian crises, we have to put feminism at the middle, and we have to understand that without discussing these things as feminist crises, we will continue to let down girls and women around the world.
You also have lived in United Kingdom, and that's a really important element at the moment, because they have choose to go out of the European Union. Many are saying, especially as Lord Ashdown have said, that that could start a vortex of disintegration in Europe and a worsening situation in Europe.
Yes.
And you know how, British society from inside out,
Yes.
what this means for Britain, but also what this means for European Union at the moment.
Right. Well, I think, I was dismayed by the Brexit vote because, as many people thought in a run-up, this could never happen, this could never happen. Now, I understand that some of the leftists in the UK who voted for it did so as a protest against austerity measures and what they considered the unfair politics of the European Union, but I think it was a very unwise move on their behalf because it ended up playing into a very right-wing, racist, fascist rhetoric that was used by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and a lot of others in the UK who pushed it as a very, as part of what we call white supremacy, that there's a group of people in the United Kingdom who are promoting the best interests of, white Britons against the interest of anyone else. And we've heard how this very, very racist and tribalist mentality has led to violence against many immigrant groups in the UK, many groups who come from various African or Muslim backgrounds, and sometimes from also other European backgrounds, like many Polish people who moved to the UK. And I was dismayed also because, we're often criticized in the Middle East and North Africa for choosing the wrong leaders or for allowing our dictators to, ruin our political system. And I look at a country like the UK and I think, you have all of the privileges in the world, and yet in the year 2016, you voted for something that represents racism and fascism. How? When you have all of these privileges, and yet you have the nerve to criticize us, where we're fighting against, after years of colonization, years of war, years of being, our dictators being armed to the teeth with billions of dollars of weapons by the EU and by the United States. So I think it's a very shameful time for the UK, and I hope that the European Union will somehow be able to fix this big problem, because I think that it's a manifestation of this growing right-wing sentiment that is dangerous not just to Europe, it's dangerous to the entire world. In the way that we talk about when you asked me the question about what's happening in Turkey, Syria, and in the Middle East and North Africa could impact the entire world, what's happening in the UK now with the consequences of Brexit is also going to impact the entire world, because we are so connected nowadays. If Donald Trump becomes the president of the United States, we often say when the United States sneezes, the entire world catches a cold. We are that interconnected, especially with these countries that send billions of dollars in aid and weapons to so many countries around the world. So I hope that the UK and I hope the European Union are able to fix this mess and rise above this right-wing sentiment that is disastrous for us all.
And let's end this conversation with the one interesting situation which is happening now. United Nations are for the first time openly electing a new Secretary General, and there is several strong female candidates in this group, potential candidates for Secretary General. Do you think that the international community at the end of this conversation will elect a female as a head of that international body which carries for human rights all over the world?
Yeah, well, it's shameful that the United Nations to this day, where 2016 now, as Justin Trudeau said, it's the 21st century, that to this day we have not had a woman Secretary General. And it's especially troublesome that the United Nations itself has not just the international community, but the UN itself, because we've been hearing about these awful stories of sexual violence and rape by United Nations so-called peacekeepers in various countries, especially in, I think it's the Congo. And you hear these terrible stories of United Nations peacekeepers demanding or giving themselves the right to rape and sexually violate girls and boys in countries where they're responsible for their well-being in exchange for food and shelter. This is disgusting and absolutely disgraceful. So I think the United Nations itself is now a manifestation of this growing scourge of sexual violence that, again, thanks to social media, is being exposed around the world. So I think that the United Nations, has to clean up its own house, by holding accountable these male peacekeepers who are sexually violating girls and boys in countries where they should be taking care of them. But also, it should also present an example to the rest of the world that we're catching up with the 21st century, and we will finally have a woman Secretary General. You know, it's a very, very interesting global moment right now, because while you're having this resurgence of right-wing ideology and fascism, there's also a chance for the world to say, look, we believe in women as leaders, and we believe in feminism as the antidote to this right-wing ideology and fascism. And as a feminist, I honestly believe this is where I talk about the social and sexual revolution. Nowhere in the world will be free, especially of fascism and right-wing ideology, without feminism. Feminism is something the entire world needs, because feminism is equality and liberation. And so the best way, the best antidote to fight right-wing ideology and fascism, whether it's the UN, whether it's here in Bosnia, whether it's in the United States, or whether it's in my part of the world, is feminism.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.